Hello, my name is Dick Noel, and I would like to talk to you today about why I believe in an afterlife. I'm a 80-year-old retired community banker from Vermont. I've been married to my lovely wife Chris for 55 years. I have 3 grown children and 2 grandsons, both in college. Now, I have studied near-death experiences for several months, and I have concluded that there has to be an afterlife. I would like to mention the name Dr. Raymond Moody. And he is 74 years old, and he has spent over 30 years studying the subject of near-death experiences. He has interviewed people from all over the world, all ages, male and female, from all different types of backgrounds, from different cultures, and he has definitely concluded that as a group, these near-death experiences actually show that there has to be an afterlife. Of the many people that Dr. Moody interviewed, there were 3 of them who were doctors, and these 3 doctors all had near-death experiences, and I would like to just briefly talk about each one. The first is named Dr. Eben Alexander. That first name is E-B-E-N, last name A-L-E-X-A-N-D-E-R. And he was a neurosurgeon who contracted a serious illness and went into a coma. His doctors felt he had a 2% chance of survival, but he did survive. And when he did, and after he survived, he talked about his near-death experience. And I won't go into all the details of what he described as this heavenly place full of love and so on that he went to, but there is an aspect of it that I will mention today. You might want to look up his YouTube videos yourself. He has also written a book called Proof of Heaven. Now, the part of Dr. Alexander's story that fascinated me was that after this near-death experience, he was adopted. He was an adopted child, and he searched for his biological parents. And after a long search, he found them, and he discovered that his father was a senior in high school and his mother was a sophomore when they had him, and they were too young to be married and raise a child. So he was adopted by loving parents who raised him quite well, and he became this successful surgeon. Well, after his near-death experience, he researched and found his adoptive parents, and found that they eventually did get married and had 3 more children. And so he actually had, I think it was 2 sisters and a brother. And one of the sisters had died, and he was able to contact the family. And he asked his brother, his biological brother, to please send him a picture of the sister that had died at, I think, in her 30s, and he had obviously never got to meet her. And eventually, that brother did send him a picture of his sister who had died, and lo and behold, she was the same person that accompanied Dr. Alexander when he flew on a butterfly's wing to this everlasting home that he went to in his near-death experience. It was his deceased sister that was accompanying him on that butterfly wing. Quite amazing story. Another doctor who I want to talk about briefly name is Dr. Anthony Cicoria. And this doctor was struck by lightning and actually was deceased for a very short time, but also went on a near-death experience out of his body, saw a nurse working on him to revive him, saw his family. They were in a family reunion. He his body traveled upstairs and saw people doing things that were later verified. And he too entered an afterlife loving atmosphere. And when he came back, the amazing thing about his story was that he suddenly developed an interest in music. He had never had much interest in music, and he particularly became addicted to listening to the piano music. And he knew nothing about playing the piano, but he took up the piano after his near-death experience and eventually wrote his own music that he had heard in his head and, to make a long story short, became a concert pianist in addition to being the head of an orthopedic surgeon department in a regional hospital. The third doctor that I would like to mention who had a near-death experience was a Dr. Mary Near. Last name is spelled Near, and you might well want to look her up on YouTube. But her near-death experience occurred in a kayak accident in South America where she was under the water for something like 20 minutes and without oxygen, but was later revived. And she could not believe the near-death experience, the afterlife, the place that she went to, the heavenly place full of love and so on. And she was so taken in by it that she was told that she had to go back, and she didn't want to go back, but eventually she did and accepted the fact that there was more work for her to do on this earth. And she had 4 children, and she in her YouTube video she talks about how she looks upon her life, her remaining life here, as a great adventure, things to be learned, problems to be solved, challenges to be met. But she knows that someday she will return to her ultimate home, which is the afterlife home that she went to in her near-death experience. It's the amazing thing about Dr. Neal's story is that in her YouTube video she tells about everything, her inspiration, her wanting to not come back, but then coming back and treating her life as an adventure, and knowing in her heart that she will someday return to this afterlife. And she does this presentation not in an hour or an hour and a half, but in 12 minutes, gets this whole message across. It's quite fascinating. Now, in addition to near-death experiences that Dr. Moody talks about in his video, he talks about something called share near-death experiences. And these are even more fascinating and exciting because they occur to people who are not injured, who are not sick, who have no problems with their brain or any illness whatsoever. But they talk about experiences where they had an out-of-body situation and so on because they were near someone who was dying or had died. I will mention 2 of these that I've come across in my research myself. One is about a man by the name of Jeff Olson, who was in a horrific car accident in which his wife was killed instantly and one of his 2 sons. And you really should look him up and see the details of his near-death experiences. But the one thing I wanted to emphasize is that several years after his near-death experience, he talked to the trauma doctor who was operating on him in the emergency room in the hospital where he was brought after the car accident. And the most amazing thing that this trauma doctor, who had no knowledge of him before, didn't know anything about his family or anything, while he was working on him, he was pretty sure that he could not save Mr. Olson and that he was definitely going to pass away permanent death. And lo and behold, he says that while he was in that mood, working, trying to save him, Jeff Olson's wife actually came into the operating room, deceased wife, and appeared before the surgeon and told him that my husband is not dying, he is not dead, he is not going to die. And he didn't. Now the surgeon admits that this happened, that this apparition of his wife came right into the operating room. And it turns out later on that the scrub nurse who was working with the trauma surgeon at the time was asked about it, and she said she did not see the deceased wife come into the operating room, but she definitely heard her voice. So that's an amazing part of Jeff Olson's story. There's much more to his story, which you should really look up on YouTube. Just type in Jeff Olson near death and it'll come up. The second shared near-death experience that really got to me was one of a man called Scott Taylor, and his experience is quite poignant and quite moving. He was going out with a woman named Mary Fran for about 6 months. He was very much in love with her, and she had a 7-year-old son, Nolan. And again, there was a horrific auto accident, and Mary Fran was killed instantly, and her 7-year-old son was mortally wounded. And they took the son to the hospital, and he lived for 5 days. But on the 5th day, he passed away. And this is where the amazing experience occurs. Scott Taylor said that he was there with a room full of relatives when Nolan straight-lined, and he said he then saw the appearance of Mary Fran come down and scoop up her son Nolan's spirit and carry them up and away. But before that happened, she turned to Scott, and he too came out of his body and went up with Mary Fran and Nolan to a heavenly light. Eventually, Scott came back to his body and all the people in the room, and he didn't tell anybody what he had seen. He just couldn't talk to anybody about it, and he was afraid they'd think he was crazy, whatever. And so he never did talk about this for 15 years. But after 15 years, he was doing a thesis for a dissertation for his PhD about near-death experience, and he was interviewing a lot of people who had had those experiences. And one of the people he interviewed was a relative who had been in the hospital room when Nolan died, along with Scott and others. And she said that she also had an out-of-body experience, went with Nolan and Mary Fran to this heavenly light, and the details of her experience were exactly the same as Scott Taylor's. So he feels, and I feel, that certainly his near-death shared experience was validated by what happened to this relative. Now, what have I learned from the research that I've done? And there's much more that I won't take the time to talk about today, but what have I learned from all of this? And I think there's several points that I think that I can say that I've come to. First of all, I believe now more than ever that God created us as human beings, not divine beings, but human beings with free will. Free will is so important to understand. And because we have free will, we make some good choices and we make some bad choices. And the bad choices that we make as humans often lead to unbelievable suffering, tragedy, wars, whatever. And this leads me to the question of that people often ask, and I ask myself, how could a God allow innocent teachers and school children to be killed in these school shootings? And how could God allow some poor soldier to fall on a hand grenade to save his buddies? And how could God allow some drunken driver to cross the wrong lane of a highway and wipe out a family, a complete family? These are things that happen several times, and we ask ourselves, well, how could that happen? And it seems to me that the only logical answer, the only answer that makes sense, is that man made some bad choices, like the drunk driver crossing the wrong lane, and because of those choices, innocent people have been killed or died prematurely. My only answer to that is God has to have taken them up to his heavenly afterlife kingdom. That's the only answer that makes any kind of sense. To cite one more example, a few years ago, do you remember a mentally ill co-pilot locked the pilot out of the plane and flew a plane into a mountain, which, among others, killed 30 innocent children who were on vacation and returning home? Now, that was a bad choice of that mentally ill co-pilot, and because of his bad choice, 30, among others, 30 innocent children were killed. Now, you can't tell me that a loving God did not take the spirits of those children and bring them into his heavenly kingdom. Of course he had to. Now, another thing that conclusion that I've come to is that um, that life review. Many of the people who have near-death experiences have what's called a life review, where every action of their life flashes before them, and they flash before them in terms of the people that were acted upon, not necessarily the person who has the near-death experience. In other words, if you were mean to somebody and did something bad during your life to someone, you will see that action from the point of view of the person that was hurt. So I guess my feeling and my point is that we should all do this near-death, this life review ourselves, and not wait for any near-death experience. Do it now. See where you've gone wrong, and if you can, make amends for those bad choices. And if you can't, I think you should pray for forgiveness. And if you do, I think you will be forgiven. There's many other things that I could talk about, but from my research, a couple of things stand out. Dr. Mary Neal's statements about going home. She makes a great analogy in her tape about where she was brought up by very loving parents and had a wonderful upbringing, and when she was a teenager she went away to summer camp, and that was a great adventure, and she learned many things, made new friends, went swimming and so on. But she said it wasn't perfect. The beds were hard, the food wasn't like mom cooked at home and so on, but she always knew that at the end of her summer camp adventure she would be going home, so she was always fine with camp. And the analogy is that now that she's had her near-death experience and has seen what the everlasting afterlife will be, she knows that someday, no matter what happens in this great adventure that she has for the remainder of her days here, she will be going home again. And I think that's something she wants us to realize, that someday we will go to that ultimate home. Trying to, I would like to also end my video with a statement that Scott Taylor makes in his interview. And he says that if we could only realize what we could learn from these near-death experiences, if we should embrace them as part of us, think what we can do for the improvement of mankind if we realize the implications of these near-death experiences and what they teach us. So anyway, that's a very rough sketch of my primitive research on the subject. I am absolutely certain, after learning all that I have, that there is an afterlife, and I want to thank you for taking the time to watch this video. I want to thank Dr. Raymond Moody for the great work that he has done. I urge you all to go to his website that was created recently, and it's called, appropriately, www.universityofheaven.com. Go to that website. There's some great material there. Dr. Moody will tell you how he himself has come to the conclusion of the existence of an afterlife. And there will also be speakers there, I'm sure, that will talk about the difference between consciousness and spirit and the body, that the brain does not secrete consciousness. Your spirit is separate from your body, and at your death the spirit will move on. So go to that University of Heaven website and subscribe to the materials that they have there. You will learn so much more. Now, if you would like to know a little bit more about Dick Noel, I have made a few music videos, and I would love to have you look at a couple of them because they're special to me. One is called Somewhere Noel Version. If you type that in the search line of your computer, just Somewhere Noel, Noel, Version, Version, If you type that in and hit it, you'll see a song that I've sung to my disabled daughter who suffers from ataxia, who's been suffering for over 10 years from something that she acquired from Legionnaire's disease, which leaves her with tremors and no balance and so on. A wonderful girl, and I sing this song to her, and you understand a little bit more about me if you hear it. And then there's one other song that I sing to my wife, and this was, I think I sung this on our 52nd wedding anniversary. It's called, and if you type this in your search engine, If Tomorrow Never Comes. If Tomorrow Never Comes, space, Noel, N-O-E-L, version, again, V-E-R-S-I-O-N. Type that in your search engine and hit it. It'll bring up that song which I sing to my wife, which shows you a little bit more about my personality. Again, thank you all for listening to me. It's been a little disjointed. I tried the best I can. Just know that because of my research into all these things, I have not had a near-death experience myself, but I've learned from others, and my faith in afterlife has been just totally strengthened, and I hope that helps you to believe in it as well. Thank you.